Pick any woman here, the sheriff laughed. I'll take the fat albino girl. The dusty street falls silent. A cruel lawman sneers and the crowd nervously chuckles. She bows her head, pale lashes trembling, humiliated before the whole town. But then, boots pound against the dirt. A battle-scarred mountain man steps forward holding a deed that changes everything. This woman the sheriff mocked? She holds the key to the valley's water, the lifeblood the railroad will kill to control. The church bell tolls. Smoke rises from burning timber. Jail keys rattle as allies are chained. Yet through fire and shame, the girl everyone laughed at begins to rise, singing hymns, sheltering orphans, daring to stand against corruption itself. But if the sheriff's lies win, the spring, the town, and her dignity will be lost forever. Will the outcast girl the whole town mocked become the one who saves them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Willow Bend's main street, casting lonely shadows between the weathered buildings. Dust swirled in the hot breeze as ranchers, railroad men, and townsfolk gathered outside the saloon, their boots scuffing the wooden sidewalks. The sharp smell of whiskey and tobacco hung in the air, mixing with leather and horse sweat. Sheriff Carter Hale stood swaying slightly on the saloon's porch, his badge gleaming dully against his dust-covered vest. His eyes were glazed from too much afternoon drinking, but they held their usual cruel glint. A nasty grin spread across his face as he raised his voice to address the growing crowd. "Now, boys," he drawled, gesturing broadly with his whiskey glass. "Seems we got ourselves a settlement to make here." He clapped a rough hand on the shoulder of a red-faced cowhand who'd been brawling moments before. "Our friend here lost fair and square, so he gets to choose himself a lady companion, ain't that right?" The cowhand stared at his boots, shame and whiskey coloring his cheeks. Down the street, several women from Miss Betty's boarding house huddled together, their faces pinched with worry. They knew Hale's idea of entertainment usually meant public humiliation for someone. "Line 'em up," Hale barked, making a sweeping motion with his arm. "Let's see what fine choices we got today." The boarding house women shuffled forward reluctantly, their skirts rustling in the dusty street. They kept their eyes down, hands clasped tightly before them. One younger girl was visibly trembling. At the edge of the crowd, Lucas Boone's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. The mountain man stood apart from the others, his tall frame rigid with tension. His weathered hand rested near his belt, though he wore no gun in town. Years of tracking and hunting had taught him to read trouble like sign in the dirt, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The sheriff's voice grew louder as he played to his audience. "Why, we got ourselves quite a selection here." He walked unsteadily along the line of women, making crude comments that drew nervous laughter from some of the onlookers. Others shifted uncomfortably, looking away. That's when Martha Jane Carter stepped out of the general store, carrying a basket of supplies. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight, and she instinctively ducked her head, letting her white blonde hair fall forward to shield her face. She tried to hurry past the crowd, but Hale's sharp eyes caught the movement. Well, he crowed, spinning around. "Look what we got here, the prettiest prize of all." His voice dripped with mockery as he pointed at Martha. "Boys, I do believe we forgot one choice specimen." Martha froze, her fingers tightening on her basket handle. Her pale lashes fluttered as she kept her eyes downcast, but her spine straightened ever so slightly. "Come on over here, girl," Hale called out, his words slurring. "Let everyone get a good look at you." When Martha didn't move, he stalked toward her, boots thudding heavily on the packed earth. Lucas took an instinctive step forward, but caught himself. His experiences as a Union scout had taught him when to wait and when to act. Still, his muscles coiled with readiness as he watched Hale approach Martha. The sheriff circled Martha like a wolf sizing up prey. "Now ain't she something special?" he sneered. "White as a ghost and round as a butter churn." He reached out and flicked Martha's basket, making her stumble slightly. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed uneasily, while others looked away in shame. A few women whispered behind their hands, but whether in sympathy or spite wasn't clear. Martha's voice came soft, but steady. "Sheriff Hale, please excuse me. I have deliveries to make." She tried to step around him, but he blocked her path. "Oh no. You don't get to run away." Hale grinned maliciously. "We're having ourselves a choosing here, and I reckon you ought to be part of it." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "Pick any woman here?" "Well, I choose the fat albino girl." The words hung in the hot air like gun smoke. Someone in the crowd gasped. The boarding house women huddled closer together, relief and guilt warring on their faces. Martha's pale hands trembled, but she didn't run. Instead, she slowly set down her basket and folded her hands together in prayer. Her lips moved silently as she stood there, head bowed but shoulders straight. Lucas felt something snap inside him at the sight. He'd seen too much injustice during the war. Too many powerful men crushing those they saw as weak. His hands clenched into fists as he watched Martha endure Hale's cruelty with quiet dignity. "Ah, look at that," Hale crowed, circling Martha again. "Praying like her dear departed papa taught her. Ain't that sweet?" He leaned in close to her ear. "Your prayers ain't going to make you any prettier, girl." Several townsfolk began to drift away, unable to watch anymore. Others stayed, trapped between morbid fascination and shame. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly as if trying to burn away the ugly scene. Martha kept praying, her pale lips forming words Lucas couldn't hear. But he could see the slight tremor in her clasped hands, the way her shoulders tensed when Hale moved behind her. Her white blonde hair gleamed in the sunlight, making her seem almost ethereal, like something too pure for the dirt and cruelty around her. "What's the matter?" Hale taunted, his voice growing harder. "Too good to answer me? Think your prayers make you better than the rest of us?" He reached for Martha's arm. Lucas took 3 long strides forward before he even realized he was moving. His voice cut through the tanatidam. "That's enough, Sheriff." Hale's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he spotted Lucas. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself." He straightened up, trying to hide his unsteady swagger. "Come to join our little party." Lucas moved to stand between Martha and the sheriff, his presence calm but unmistakably threatening. "No party here," he said quietly. "Just a man making a fool of himself." A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew Lucas Boone's reputation, his skill with tracking, his history as a Union scout, the way he kept to himself up in the mountains. They also knew he rarely came to town and never got involved in local matters. Hale's face darkened. "You threatening me, Mountain Man?" "No threat," Lucas replied evenly. "Just stating facts." He turned slightly to Martha, keeping Hale in his peripheral vision. "Miss Carter, may I help you with your deliveries?" Martha's pale eyes widened slightly as she looked up at Lucas. Something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a shared outsider status. She nodded once, retrieving her basket. "Now wait just a minute," Hale sputtered, his hand moving toward his gun. "We ain't finished here." "We are," Lucas said simply. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the words. He'd seen too much death during the war to fear Hale's drunken posturing. The sheriff looked around at the crowd seeking support but found only uncomfortable faces and averted eyes. The spell of cruel entertainment was broken. Even the most hardened railroad men seemed ashamed now, remembering perhaps their own sisters or daughters back home. Lucas stood perfectly still, his presence a wall between Martha and Hale. The mountain man's eyes never left the sheriff's face, reading every twitch and tell like he would read sign on a trail. Years of tracking had taught him when an animal would attack and when it would back down. Hale finally broke first, forcing a laugh that fooled no one. "Ain't worth my time anyway," he muttered, stumbling back toward the saloon. "Take the ghost girl if you want her." The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in uncomfortable whispers. The boarding house women hurried away, shooting mixed looks of sympathy and relief toward Martha. The afternoon sun continued its relentless beatdown on the dusty street, unchanged by the ugly scene it had witnessed. Lucas turned fully to Martha then, his expression softening slightly. "Which way are your deliveries headed, Miss Carter?" Martha's pale fingers worked at the basket handle, but her voice was steady when she answered. "West end of town, Mr. Boone. But you needn't trouble yourself." "No trouble," he cut in gently. "I'm headed that way myself." They both knew it was a lie. Lucas Boone never had business in town unless absolutely necessary. But Martha nodded, accepting the kindness for what it was. As they walked away from the saloon, her quiet voice drifted back to him. "Thank you." Lucas simply nodded, his eyes scanning the street ahead as they walked. He could feel Hale's glare burning into his back from the saloon window, but paid it no mind. He'd faced worse than a drunken sheriff during the war. What worried him more was the quiet dignity of the woman beside him and the strange protective instinct she stirred in his heart. Behind them, the main street of Willow Bend gradually returned to its usual afternoon bustle, though something had shifted in the town's atmosphere. The casual cruelty they'd witnessed would not be forgotten quickly, especially by those who had stood by in silence. Evening shadows stretched across Willow Bend's main street like long fingers reaching. Between buildings, the late summer air hung heavy with dust and lingering mockery. Martha stood perfectly still, her pale features composed despite the cruel laughter still bouncing off the weathered storefronts. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, preparing to turn away with what dignity remained. The basket of mending she'd brought to town trembled slightly in her grip, but she steadied it, just as she'd learned to steady herself through years of taunts. "Now hold on there." Sheriff Hale's voice rang out, slurred but commanding. He stumbled forward from the saloon porch, boots scraping against wooden planks. "This here choosing ain't finished. Someone ought to take her. Save us all from looking at that ghost-white face every Sunday." More laughter rippled through the crowd, though some townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. Martha closed her eyes briefly, sending up a silent prayer for strength. When she opened them again, movement at the edge of the gathering caught her attention. Lucas Boone pushed through the crowd like a storm front rolling over mountains. His broad shoulders and tall frame parted the onlookers easily, some stepping back at the sight of his grim expression. Trail dust still clung to his buckskin jacket, and his dark beard couldn't hide the tight set of his jaw. "There's no need for taking," Lucas said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "Miss Carter is already spoken for." Sheriff Hale squinted at the mountain man, swaying slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lucas reached inside his coat with deliberate slowness. The crowd held its breath, but instead of a weapon, he withdrew a folded paper, aged and creased, but clearly official. "It means she's my lawful bride by arrangement with her father before he passed." A collective gasp swept through the gathering. Martha's hands tightened on her basket as she stared at Lucas, her pale eyes wide with surprise. She'd seen the reclusive mountain man in town perhaps 3 times in as many years, and never had he spoken more than a courteous word to anyone. "Let me see that." Hale snatched the paper from Lucas's hand, nearly tearing it in his haste. He squinted at the writing, holding it close to his face in the fading light. His lips moved as he read, the smirk gradually fading from his face. "Read it out," someone called from the crowd. Others joined in, curiosity overwhelming their earlier cruelty. Hale cleared his throat, trying to sound official despite his drink-thickened tongue. "This here document, dated 5th of May, 1868, establishes the marriage arrangement between Lucas Jonathan Boone and Martha Jane Carter, as witnessed and approved by Reverend William Carter before his death." He paused, his face darkening as he continued. "Furthermore, it names Martha Jane Carter as sole heir to the Carter Springwater Tract, comprising 40 acres of land, including the main source of—" His voice trailed off as the implications sank in. More gasps and whispers swept through the crowd. Everyone knew the value of that spring. It was the only reliable water source for miles around, vital for both cattle and the railroad's steam engines. Martha felt her world tilting. The spring had been her father's pride, his guarantee that the community would always have water to share. She'd known she would inherit it eventually, but hadn't realized her father had made it official before his passing. Hale's face twisted with rage as he looked up from the paper. The drunken mockery was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "This is mighty convenient timing, Boone," he spat. "Where's this deed been hiding all this while?" "Safe," Lucas answered simply. He moved to stand beside Martha, his presence solid and reassuring. "Waiting for the right time." "Right time?" Hale barked a harsh laugh. "You mean waiting till you could use it against me?" "Against the railroad's interests?" He waved the paper dangerously close to a nearby lamp. "This here marriage arrangement, it ain't been properly recorded. Could be a forgery. Could be all kinds of things wrong with it." Martha felt her heart skip, but then something shifted inside her. Years of bearing taunts and mockery had built strength she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped forward and plucked the document from Hale's unsteady hands. "That's my father's signature," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent street. "And his seal as an ordained minister. I'd know them anywhere." She carefully folded the paper and held it close, her chin lifting for the first time that evening. "If you wish to question it, you'll need to do so through proper legal channels, Sheriff." The crowd murmured in surprise. Few had ever heard Martha speak so firmly or with such authority. Even Lucas glanced at her with something like admiration in his weathered features. Hale's face flushed dark with fury. He leaned in close, his words meant for Martha and Lucas alone. "Don't think this is over. That spring's too valuable to let some albino girl and her mountain man control it. This supposed marriage of yours won't stand up to proper scrutiny." "Perhaps not," Lucas replied evenly. "But for now it stands." He turned slightly toward Martha, his voice gentling. "My wagon's just down the street, Mrs. Boone. Allow me to see you home." Martha nodded, grateful for the gathering darkness that hid her blush at the unexpected title. She could feel the crowd's eyes following them as Lucas guided her away from the saloon, his hand hovering near but not quite touching her elbow. The townsfolk began to disperse, spreading out into the deepening twilight like leaves scattered by wind. Their whispers would carry the story to every corner of Willow Bend before morning. The sheriff's cruel game had backfired, the scorned preacher's daughter held power over the precious spring, and the mysterious mountain man had claimed her as his bride. Lucas helped Martha into his wagon with careful courtesy. As he settled beside her on the bench, she clutched the precious document in her lap, still trembling slightly from the confrontation. "Mr. Boone," she began softly, "I don't understand." "Lucas," he corrected, gathering the reins. "Best get used to calling me that, given the circumstances." He paused, then added quietly, "You won't have to face their shame alone anymore." "I give you my word on that." Martha nodded, words failing her as the wagon rolled away from town. Behind them, lamplight began to glow in windows, and somewhere a dog barked at the rising moon. The evening air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but Martha barely noticed. Her mind whirled with questions about the deed, the spring, and most of all, the quiet man beside her who had stepped forward to defend her honor with an unexpected claim. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as they left the main street behind, heading toward the darker shadows of the foothills where Lucas made his home. Neither spoke for several minutes, each lost in thought about how a single piece of paper had changed everything. Finally, Martha broke the silence. "The sheriff won't let this rest." "No," Lucas agreed, his eyes on the darkening trail. "He won't." He glanced at her briefly. "But neither will we." The simple statement carried the weight of a solemn promise, hanging in the air between them as the wagon rolled on into the gathering night. Martha's fingers traced the edges of the deed that had transformed her from a scorned outsider to a woman of unexpected importance and the alleged bride of the most mysterious man in Willow Bend. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Lucas's wagon rolled away from Willow Bend. Martha sat straight-backed on the wooden seat, her few possessions packed in 2 small trunks behind them. The early morning air held a bite that made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wagon's wheels bumped over ruts and rocks as they left the well-worn town roads for rougher terrain. Martha gripped the seat's edge but kept her chin high, determined not to show weakness. Still, each jolt sent a shudder through her frame, unused to such travel. "Road gets worse before it gets better," Lucas said, his first words since they'd set out. "Spring rains washed out some parts." Martha nodded, swallowing hard as the wagon lurched again. "I've never been this far from town before," she admitted softly. Lucas glanced at her, noting her whitened knuckles but also her determined expression. "Most folks haven't. That's partly why I chose this place." The sun climbed higher as they traveled, the wagon following an increasingly narrow track into the foothills. Scrub brush gave way to scattered pines, their shadows stretching across the path. Martha watched a hawk circle overhead, its cry piercing the morning quiet. "May I ask?" she began hesitantly, then gathered her courage. "Why did you choose to live so far out?" Lucas was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "War changes a man. Served as a Union scout. Saw things." He paused, adjusting the reins. "After, I couldn't stomach being around too many people. Noise. Crowds out here. A man can hear himself think." Martha absorbed this, thinking of the rumors she'd heard about the quiet mountain man. "My father used to say that solitude can be a balm for troubled spirits." "Your father was a wise man." Lucas's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Speaking of which, there's something you should know about that deed." Martha's heart skipped, but before she could respond, the wagon hit a particularly deep rut. She gasped, nearly sliding off the seat, but Lucas's arm shot out to steady her. "Thank you," she murmured, then gathered her courage. "What about the deed?" "It's genuine enough, your father's signature, the spring rites. But the marriage arrangement?" He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "That part was added later. By me." Martha's breath caught. "You forged it?" "Modified it. To protect you." His jaw tightened. "Saw how Hale was looking at you. Man like that, with power and meanness in him, he needed a reason to back down. Property rights he might challenge, but marriage claims are harder to break." Martha sat in silence, processing this revelation. The ethical weight of it pressed against her Christian upbringing, yet she couldn't deny the protection it had provided. Finally, she spoke softly. "You risked much, interfering like that." Lucas shrugged. "Seemed right at the time. Still does." They traveled on as the sun climbed higher. Martha's muscles ached from the constant jolting, but she didn't complain. Instead, she found herself studying her unexpected protector's profile, the weathered lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders remained squared even after hours of driving. Near midday, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Martha stretched her legs carefully, watching as Lucas checked the horse's hooves and harness with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Boone." "Lucas," she corrected herself. "There's something you should know as well." She took a deep breath. "People say my condition marks me as cursed. That's why most won't look me in the eye, why they whisper when I pass." Her pale fingers twisted in her skirts. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Lucas straightened from his inspection of the horses, fixing her with a direct look. "Folks say a lot of things. Most of it ain't worth the breath they waste on it." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "You're under my protection now. Anyone wants to whisper about curses, they'll answer to me." Martha blinked rapidly, touched by the quiet conviction in his words. They resumed their journey shortly after, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. As the day wore on, the terrain gradually changed. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, following the contours of the land. Finally, as the sun began its westward slide, Lucas pointed ahead. There. Home. Martha leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of her new dwelling. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, backed by rising hills and sheltered by tall pines. It was larger than she'd expected. Sturdy logs carefully fitted with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke rose. A half-finished corral stood to one side, its new posts contrasting with the weathered ones. Lucas guided the wagon to a stop near the cabin's door. "It ain't much," he said, something almost apologetic in his tone. "Basic, but solid." "It's—" Martha paused, searching for the right words. "It feels peaceful here." He nodded, satisfied with her assessment. While Lucas unloaded her trunks, Martha approached the cabin carefully. The door opened to reveal a simple but clean interior, one main room with a stone hearth, rough-hewn furniture, and a ladder leading to what she assumed was a sleeping loft. The hearth held banked coals, explaining the smoke they'd seen. Martha knelt beside it automatically, her practiced hands adding kindling and coaxing the fire back to life. The familiar task helped settle her nerves. Lucas carried in her trunks, setting them carefully against one wall. He moved with the deliberate efficiency she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him. No motion wasted. "Need to see to the horses," he said. "Make yourself at home, as you can." Alone in the cabin, Martha explored her new surroundings. Everything was plain but serviceable. A table with 2 chairs, shelves holding basic provisions, a few hooks for clothes. Simplicity spoke of a life stripped to essentials, yet she sensed no neglect, only purpose. When Lucas returned, she had a pot of beans warming over the fire and had found flour to make fresh bread. They worked around each other carefully, conscious of sharing space for the first time. Lucas brought in water from the spring, while Martha set out their simple supper on the scarred wooden table. Night fell quickly in the valley. Through the cabin's single window, Martha could see stars appearing, brilliant in the clear mountain air. The silence felt different from town, deeper, but somehow less lonely. A coyote's yip echoed from the hills, answered by others in a wild chorus. They ate mostly in silence, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. Martha noticed how Lucas kept glancing at her, as if checking that she was real, that she was truly there. She recognized the weight settling on his shoulders, the responsibility he'd taken on in claiming her as his bride, even if only on paper. After they'd finished eating, Martha folded her hands and bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table. "Thank you for this food, this shelter, and this safety you've provided tonight. Amen." Lucas hadn't joined in the prayer, but he'd stayed respectfully quiet. Now he rose, clearing their bowls with the same efficiency he showed in everything. "Loft's yours," he said. "I'll sleep down here by the fire." Martha nodded, grateful for his consideration. The day's journey had left her exhausted, her muscles protesting every movement. Yet, as she climbed the ladder to the loft, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The cabin might be bare of comforts, but it offered something town never had. Acceptance. From below came the sounds of Lucas banking the fire for the night. Martha changed into her nightgown behind the privacy of a hung blanket, then knelt beside her bed, a simple straw tick, but clean and sweet-smelling with fresh pine needles. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time to both God and the quiet man below, "for this refuge." The coyotes sang their wild song to the moon, but Martha felt no fear. Instead, as she drifted toward sleep, she felt an unfamiliar peace settling over her, like a warm blanket. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was safe. Dawn crept over the mountain valley, painting the cabin's weathered logs in soft gold. Martha woke to birdsong and the distant sound of chopping wood. For a moment, she lay still in the loft, remembering where she was. The straw tick rustled as she rose, smoothing her simple cotton dress and pinning her pale hair neatly beneath her cap. The cabin below was empty, the hearth cold. Through the window, she could see Lucas at work, his steady rhythm splitting logs for the woodpile. Martha squared her shoulders. She hadn't come here to be idle. First, she tackled the hearth. On her knees, she scraped away old ashes and scrubbed the stone until it gleamed. The physical work felt good, purposeful. When flames danced again in the clean fireplace, she surveyed the rest of the cabin with careful eyes. The curtains hanging at the windows caught her attention. They were torn in places, more patch than original fabric. Martha found her sewing kit in her trunk and settled by the window, where morning light could guide her stitches. Her pale fingers moved surely, mending each tier with tiny even stitches. As she worked, she unpacked the provisions she'd brought from town. The flour sack was still nearly full. She'd traded her mother's silver thimble for it just yesterday, knowing bread would be needed. Martha mixed the dough with practiced hands, kneading it on the scrubbed tabletop while the cabin filled with the promising smell of yeast and warmth. Outside, the rhythmic sound of chopping continued. Martha glanced through the newly mended curtains to see Lucas pausing to wipe his brow. His shirt clung to broad shoulders, and his movements spoke of long experience with such labor. She noticed how his eyes occasionally flicked toward the cabin, checking on her in his quiet way. The morning passed steadily. Martha had just pulled golden loaves from the oven when a small sound at the door made her turn. 2 children stood in the doorway, a boy of about 10 and a younger girl, perhaps 7. Both were barefoot, their clothes patched and dusty. The boy held his sister's hand protectively, but his eyes fixed hungrily on the fresh bread. "Please, ma'am," he said, voice rough with pride and need. "Might you spare a crust?" Martha's heart clenched at their thin faces. Come in," she said softly, pulling out chairs. "I'm Martha. What are your names?" "I'm Tommy," the boy said, helping his sister onto a chair. "This here's Clara. Our ma and pa." His voice caught. "Cholera took them. 3 weeks passed." Clara's small fingers clutched her brother's sleeve. Her eyes were huge in her thin face, but she managed a shy smile when Martha set thick slices of warm bread before them. "Eat slowly now," Martha cautioned gently, adding cups of fresh spring water. She watched them try to maintain manners despite their hunger, and her throat tightened with emotion. Heavy boots on the porch announced Lucas's return. He stopped short in the doorway, taking in the scene with surprise that quickly shifted to concern. His eyes met Martha's, questioning. She drew him aside, speaking low. "They're orphans, Lucas. Their parents lost to cholera. They need food, shelter. Martha," his voice was gentle but firm. "Winter's coming. Food's already dear enough for 2. My father always said our table should stretch to feed any hungry child," Martha pressed. He'd quote Matthew, "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, looking from Martha's earnest face to the children carefully eating their bread. Tommy had torn his slice in half, making sure Clara got the bigger portion. The gesture wasn't lost on Lucas. He'd done the same for his own little brother long ago. Finally, he sighed. They can stay. For now. Martha's smile was like sunrise. She squeezed his arm briefly before turning back to the children. "Tommy, Clara, would you like to stay with us for a while?" Clara's eyes widened. "Really, truly?" "Really, truly," Martha confirmed, her heart warming at the hope blooming on their faces. The rest of the day took on a different rhythm. Martha set Tommy to helping her gather eggs from the half-dozen hens that scratched in the yard, while Clara proved surprisingly capable at sorting dried beans for supper. Lucas continued his work on the corral, but Martha noticed how he kept the children in sight, his protective instinct already extending to include them. As evening approached, Martha prepared a simple but filling supper. The cabin filled with smells of bean soup and fresh bread, and something else, something that had been missing before. It took her a moment to identify it. Laughter. Clara had discovered a rag doll forgotten in a corner, and her delighted giggles mixed with Tommy's more reserved chuckles as they played. The sound seemed to fill the cabin's empty spaces, softening its rough edges. Lucas came in from his work, washing up at the pump outside before joining them at the table. Martha saw how his eyes took in the scene. The children's faces cleaned and brightened with food and safety, the simple meal steaming in their bowls, the mended curtains glowing in the sunset light. Something in his expression shifted, softened. Grace was said, and they ate together. Tommy told them about his father's work as a wagon master, pride and grief mingling in his voice. Clara hummed a tune their mother used to sing, and Martha joined in softly. Even Lucas contributed, answering Tommy's eager questions about tracking and hunting with patient detail. After supper, Martha made pallets near the hearth, using quilts from her trunk. The children were tired, the day's emotions and full bellies drawing them toward sleep. She tucked them in with gentle hands, smoothing Clara's hair back from her forehead and straightening Tommy's collar. "Rest now," she murmured. "You're safe here." Lucas had stepped outside with his pipe, seeking the evening air. Martha found him leaning against the porch post, smoke curling up toward the first stars. His expression was thoughtful. "Thank you," she said, quietly. Knowing he'd understand, she meant more than just the day's kindness. He nodded, drawing on his pipe. The ember's glow illuminated the lines of his face, still stern but somehow softer than before. Inside, they could hear Clara's soft breathing and Tommy's occasional murmur as the children drifted toward sleep. "Never thought to hear young one's laughter in this cabin again," Lucas said finally. His voice was gruff, but held no regret. "Changes things." Martha stood quietly beside him, watching night settle over their valley. "Good changes, I hope?" He was silent for a long moment, but when he spoke, his voice held something she hadn't heard before, the faintest trace of warmth, like spring thaw in winter ground. "Reckon so," he said. "Reckon so." They stayed there a while longer, the cool mountain air settling around them like a blessing. Through the cabin window, the hearth's glow painted squares of light on the packed earth of the yard. Inside, 2 orphaned children slept safe and fed. Outside, 2 lonely adults stood watching the stars emerge, feeling the first stirrings of something like hope. For Lucas, the realization came slowly. For the first time in years, he wasn't dreading the dawn. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Food to find, work to do, children to care for. But it would also bring Martha's quiet strength, Tommy's eager questions, Clara's shy smiles. Somehow his solitary cabin had become something else. The beginning of a home. Word traveled fast in Willow Bend. By the 3rd morning after Martha's arrival at Lucas's cabin, the general store buzzed with talk. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, measured coffee beans while listening to her customers' chatter. "Heard they took in those Miller orphans," Sarah Jenkins said, adjusting her shawl. "My Thomas saw them yesterday. Said the children looked clean and well fed." Martha always did have a gentle way, Mrs. Peterson agreed, tying the coffee package with string. Used to help teach Sunday school before her father passed. The bell above the door chimed as more customers entered. Conversations dropped to whispers, heads bent close together over barrels of dried goods and shelves of canned preserves. "But an albino woman living out there with that mountain man?" Rebecca Wilson's voice carried clearly, though she tried to whisper. "It ain't natural. And that spring they're claiming, pure fresh water like that's too valuable to leave in their hands." "Hush now," Mrs. Peterson cautioned. But the damage was done. More whispers rippled through the store, some defending Martha's kindness, others questioning Lucas's stability after the war. Sheriff Hale chose that moment to swagger in, his badge catching the morning light. He leaned against the counter, making sure everyone could hear him. "Railroads bringing progress to this territory," he announced, helping himself to a peppermint stick. "Can't let valuable water rights get tied up by some preacher's odd daughter and a half-wild veteran. Why, I heard he barely speaks to civilized folk anymore." Mrs. Peterson's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The sheriff's words settled like dust in the store's corners, feeding doubts and fears. Miles away, unaware of the town's gossip, Martha and Lucas walked a narrow trail through pine woods. The morning air was crisp, scented with sage and sun-warmed rock. Martha's skirts brushed against wildflowers, and Lucas led, the way with sure steps. "The spring's just ahead," he said, holding back a branch for her to pass. "Watch your step here. Rocks can be slippery." They emerged into a natural bowl of granite, where clear water welled up from deep in the earth. The spring formed a pool perhaps 20 feet across, its surface like polished glass. Tiny blue flowers dotted the banks, and an ancient pine provided dappled shade. Martha caught her breath at the beauty of it. She knelt carefully at the water's edge, her pale fingers trailing in the cool clarity. Without hesitation, she bowed her head in prayer. "Lord," she said softly, "let these waters be a blessing to many. Let them nurture life and bring hope, like the springs of living water you promised." Lucas stood quietly, his own weathered hands clasped behind his back. When Martha finished her prayer, he spoke carefully. "Railroad's been sniffing around this water for months," he said. "Their steam engines need good water, free of minerals that could foul the boilers. This spring's pure as they come." Martha looked up at him, understanding dawning in her pale eyes. "That's why the sheriff was so angry about the deed." Lucas nodded grimly. "They figured to take it easy enough from a preacher's daughter. Didn't count on." He hesitated. "On you protecting me," Martha finished quietly. Their eyes met, sharing a moment of understanding about the depth of his intervention that day in town. The walk back was thoughtful, both considering the weight of what they protected. As they approached the cabin, Lucas tensed. A horse was tied to the rail, a paint pony with distinctive markings. "Henry," Lucas said, but his voice held recognition rather than alarm. A tall figure rose from the porch steps, a native man dressed in a mixture of traditional and frontier clothing. His black hair was braided, and his face bore the quiet dignity of one who walked between two worlds. "Brother," Henry Greyhawk said simply, extending his hand to Lucas. They clasped forearms in the way of old comrades. Martha approached, and Henry turned to her with grave courtesy. "Miss Carter," he said, "I am Henry Greyhawk. I served with Lucas during the war." "Welcome to our home," Martha replied warmly. "Please join us for supper." "We have bean soup and fresh bread." Henry's eyes crinkled slightly at her immediate hospitality, but his news couldn't wait. "I came to warn you," he said. "Hale and the railroad men, they plot against you. They speak of false papers, of claims that your deed is forged." Lucas's jaw tightened. Figured they might try something like that. "They will not stop at papers," Henry continued. "I have heard talk in places they think I cannot understand. They speak of force, if necessary." Martha's hand flew to her throat, but her voice remained steady. "Then we must be ready. Please, Mr. Greyhawk, share our meal. We can talk more inside." The cabin was warm and fragrant with cooking. Tommy and Clara, initially shy of the visitor, soon relaxed when Henry showed them how to make simple carvings from pine wood. Martha served the soup in her best bowls, wedding gifts from her father's congregation, carefully transported to her new home. Lamplight cast soft shadows as they ate and talked. Henry spoke of his people's struggles with broken treaties, of water rights stolen through paper laws and false promises. Lucas added his own knowledge of the railroad's tactics learned during his scouting days. Martha listened intently, her quick mind finding connections. "So they'll try legal means first," she said. "But if that fails, they will not respect the law they claim to serve," Henry confirmed. "The spring is too valuable." Tommy, helping clear the bowls, straightened his shoulders. "We'll help protect it, won't we, Lucas?" Lucas's weathered hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder. "We'll do what's right, son. All of us together." Clara had fallen asleep in Martha's lap, her small face peaceful. Martha stroked the child's hair, thinking of the strange family they were becoming. A mountain man, an albino preacher's daughter, 2 orphans, and now a Ute scout sharing their table. Henry watched them with knowing eyes. "You have made a good beginning here," he said. "A home where there was only shelter before. Such things are worth protecting." The lamp burned lower, its light gleaming on the simple furnishings. Martha's Bible on the shelf, Lucas's rifle above the door, the children's new wooden toys, Henry's hat hung respectfully on a peg. Outside, crickets sang in the darkness and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine. "Will you stay the night?" Martha asked Henry. "There's space by the hearth, and breakfast in the morning." Henry considered, then nodded. "I would be honored, and tomorrow we can speak more of how to defend what is yours." Lucas added wood to the fire, its warmth reaching into the cabin's corners. Martha settled Clara more comfortably, while Tommy made up a pallet for their guest. The night deepened around them, but within the cabin's walls something strong was taking shape, an alliance born of shared meals and common cause, of respect and understanding. They were no longer alone in their stand against Hale and his schemes. As Martha banked the fire for the night, she whispered another prayer of gratitude. The spring's pure waters had already begun their work of blessing, drawing together unlikely friends in defense of what was right. The early morning sun found Martha in her kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she kneaded dough with practiced hands. The idea had come to her during prayers, a gathering of neighbors to bridge the growing divides in their community. Lucas had listened quietly when she proposed it, then nodded his approval. "Reckoned folks could use some fellowship," he'd said, already planning where people might sit. Now the cabin hummed with preparation. Outside, Lucas's axe rang steadily as he shaped rough-hewn benches from spare timber. The sound mingled with Tommy's cheerful whistling as he swept the yard clean of pine needles. Clara sat on the porch steps, carefully threading wild flowers into chains for decoration. Martha's pale hands worked the dough with purpose, her movements sure despite the heat of the day. 6 loaves already cooled on the windowsill, their crusty brown surfaces catching golden light. The 7th she shaped now, and adding a sprinkle of dried herbs from her father's old medicine pouch. "Smells mighty fine in here," Lucas said, pausing in the doorway. Sawdust clung to his shirt, and sweat darkened his hair beneath his hat. "Bench making's nearly done." Martha smiled, pleased at how naturally they'd fallen into working together. "The Lord provides," she said softly. "Even the flour. Mrs. Peterson at the store gave me extra when she heard about the gathering." Lucas nodded, understanding. Small kindnesses were appearing more frequently, a basket of eggs left on the porch, offers to mind the children while Martha worked, friendly waves from passing wagons. The community was slowly warming to them. As evening approached, the first guests began arriving. Ranch families came early, their wagons loaded with dishes to share, bean pots wrapped in quilts, fruit pies still warm from the oven, jars of preserved vegetables. Henry Greyhawk appeared with several families from his village, bearing fresh-caught fish and wild berries. The children were first to break the ice. Tommy and Clara led the others in games of tag around the yard, their laughter carrying on the cooling air. Fireflies began to rise from the grass, and soon a dozen children darted about trying to catch the dancing lights in their cupped hands. Women spread blankets on the ground, arranging their dishes with care. Martha moved among them, making introductions, her pale skin less startling to those who saw how naturally she welcomed everyone. Her soft voice and gentle manner drew people in, helping them forget their initial discomfort. "These biscuits are just perfect, Martha," Sarah Johnson, a rancher's wife, declared. "Would you share the recipe?" "Of course," Martha replied warmly. "It was my mother's. She always said good food builds bridges between hearts." Lucas watched from near the cabin wall, noting how the gathering was changing. Ranchers who normally kept to themselves were talking easily with townspeople. Native children played alongside settler kids, sharing toys and games without hesitation. The evening air filled with conversation and laughter. As twilight deepened, Martha stepped onto the porch. Her voice, though trembling slightly, rose clear and sweet in the opening notes of Amazing Grace. For a moment she sang alone, then others joined in. The hymn swelled, voices blending in harmony that seemed to touch the darkening sky. Even those who'd come skeptically found themselves drawn in. Old Jim Taylor, known for his gruff manner, wiped his eyes when they sang Sweet Hour of Prayer. Mrs. Peterson from the store, who'd initially hung back, now sat comfortably between a ranch wife and a native grandmother, sharing a plate of cornbread. In the shadows beyond the lantern light, two figures watched silently. Hale's deputies noted every person present, every interaction. Their presence went unnoticed, but their reports would fuel the sheriff's growing concern about the albino girl's influence. The evening flowed on, rich with moments of connection. Henry Greyhawk shared stories that had children and adults alike leaning forward to listen. Lucas found himself drawn into conversations about cattle trails and weather signs. Martha moved among the guests like a gentle spirit, topping up cups, offering fresh bread, ensuring everyone felt welcome. As the stars emerged, parents began gathering sleepy children. Lanterns bobbed like earthbound stars as wagons and riders headed home. The last guests lingered, helping to fold blankets and stack empty dishes. "This was real fine, Miss Martha," old Jim Taylor said gruffly. "Been too long since we had proper fellowship in these parts?" Martha pressed his hand warmly. "You're welcome any time, mister." Taylor. "All of you are." When the final lantern had disappeared down the trail, Martha turned to find Lucas watching her. His expression was thoughtful, almost wondering. "You've done something remarkable here," he said quietly. "Brought folks together who barely spoke before. Takes courage to reach out like that." Martha ducked her head, but her smile was bright. "The Lord gives strength where it's needed," she replied. "And you helped make it possible. This home you've shared, the benches you built, the way you made everyone feel safe." Inside the cabin, Tommy and Clara were already half asleep on their quilts near the hearth. Martha tucked them in, smoothing Clara's hair and adjusting Tommy's blanket. Their faces glowed with contentment in the dying firelight. Lucas stepped out onto the porch, needing a moment with his thoughts. The night air carried traces of wood smoke and distant sage. Above, stars scattered across the dark sky like dropped silver. His heart felt oddly full, stirred by feelings he'd thought long buried under war memories and solitude. Hope. That's what it was. Hope blooming like spring flowers after winter's freeze. He watched a last firefly drift past, its light a tiny echo of the warmth he'd witnessed this evening. Martha had shown him that walls could come down, that hearts could open, that faith could build bridges stronger than fear. He remained on the porch a while longer, treasuring the quiet aftermath of fellowship. The evening's success had proved Martha right. There was healing in coming together, strength in shared songs and simple meals. Even his own guarded heart had been touched by the gathering's gentle power. Inside, he could hear Martha humming softly as she banked the fire for the night. The sound wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, reminding him that he was no longer alone in his stand against whatever challenges lay ahead. They had built something here, something worth protecting, something that could grow stronger with each passing day. The night deepened around the cabin, peaceful and full of promise. Crickets chirped their evening song, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the hills. Lucas drew in a deep breath, holding on to this moment of quiet joy, this unexpected gift of community that Martha's courage had brought into their lives. The week after the gathering dawned crisp and clear, with no hint of the destruction to come. Martha had risen early as usual, stoking the hearth fire, and beginning to mix biscuit dough while Tommy and Clara still slept peacefully on their quilts. Lucas had already gone out to check the horses, his boots crunching on frost-covered grass. The first warning came as a thunder of hooves approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. Martha looked up from her work, flour dusting her pale hands, just as Lucas burst through the door. "Riders coming fast," he said tersely. "Wake the children." Now, Martha didn't hesitate. She shook Tommy and Clara gently but urgently. "Up quick, little ones. We need to go outside." The children blinked sleepily, but years of hardship had taught them to respond to danger. They scrambled to their feet just as the first flaming torch arced through the window, shattering glass and spreading fire across the wooden floor. "Out the back!" Lucas shouted, grabbing blankets from the children's beds. Martha snatched up the iron kettle from the hearth, their only cooking pot, and hustled Tommy and Clara toward the rear door. More torches flew, and smoke began filling the cabin's interior. They stumbled into the cold morning air as flames licked up the cabin's walls. Clara coughed, clinging to Martha's skirts, while Tommy stared wide-eyed at their burning home. Martha wrapped them both in the blankets Lucas had saved, her own eyes stinging from smoke and unshed tears. Lucas raced to the spring, returning with bucket after bucket of water. He threw them against the flames, but the fire had too strong a hold. Black smoke billowed into the dawn sky, marking their tragedy for all to see. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Sheriff Hale appeared with several deputies, their faces hard in the growing light. Behind them rode Henry Greyhawk, his hands bound, chain links clinking ominously. "Well, well," Hale drawled, satisfaction dripping from his voice. "Seems you've had some trouble here, Boone." Lucas straightened, water dripping from his hands. "You're doing, Hale?" The sheriff spread his hands in mock innocence. "Now how could I have anything to do with this? I'm just here about them horses your Indian friend stole." "What horses?" Martha stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Henry Greyhawk is an honest man. Got witnesses say different." Hale nodded to his deputies, who yanked Greyhawk forward. The proud scout stood silent, dignity intact despite his chains. 3 ranch horses gone missing last night. Tracks lead right to his camp. People from town began arriving, drawn by the smoke. They gathered at a cautious distance, watching the confrontation unfold. Martha recognized faces from their gathering. Mrs. Peterson, Jim Taylor, the Johnson family, but most avoided her eyes. "This is wrong," Martha called out to them. "You know Henry. You broke bread with him just days ago. He would never steal horses." Hale's lip curled. "Folks are starting to wonder about you, girl." "Ain't natural, that white skin of yours. Some say it's a curse, bringing bad luck to honest people. First the spring water goes bitter, now horses missing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Martha felt their fear and suspicion like physical blows, but she held her head high. "The Lord made me as I am," she said clearly. "My skin is no curse, and these are lies you're spreading." Lucas's hands clenched into fists. He took a step toward. Hale, violence written in every line of his body. Martha caught his arm, fingers digging into his sleeve. "No," she whispered urgently. "Violence will only damn us further. They'll hang you, and what then becomes of us?" The muscle in Lucas's jaw worked, but he stopped. They both knew she spoke truth. The law would side with Hale, no matter how unjust. "Take him to jail," Hale ordered his deputies, jerking his head toward Greyhawk. "We'll have a proper trial tomorrow. Might even find a rope waiting." "You cannot do this," Martha protested, but her words fell on deaf ears. The crowd parted as the deputies led Greyhawk away, his head held high despite his chains. The sheriff turned his horse, smirking down at them. "Might want to consider moving on," he suggested. "Ain't healthy for cursed folks around here." He rode away, leaving them standing in the ashes of their home. The townsfolk drifted away one by one, shame and fear warring on their faces. Only Mrs. Peterson approached, pressing a small sack of cornmeal into Martha's hands before hurrying after the others. The cabin continued to smolder as the sun climbed higher. Lucas salvaged what he could from the ruins, a few tools, Martha's father's Bible miraculously spared, a scorched kettle. The children huddled together in their blankets, watching silently. "What do we do now?" Tommy asked finally, his young voice trembling. Martha knelt beside them, gathering both children close. "We pray," she said softly. "We pray and we keep faith. The Lord hasn't abandoned us yet. As evening approached, they made camp beneath a stand of pines near the spring. Lucas built a small fire, and Martha used their saved kettle to make a thin soup from the cornmeal. They shared the hardtack Lucas had found in his saddlebags. The hard bread softened in the warm broth. Stars emerged overhead, countless points of light in the vast darkness. Clara had fallen asleep, her head in Martha's lap, while Tommy struggled to keep his eyes open. Lucas sat across the fire, his face shadowed with worry and anger. Martha's quiet voice rose in prayer, carrying to the night sky. Lord, we thank you for sparing our lives this day. We ask for strength to face what comes and wisdom to find your path through this valley. Protect Henry Greyhawk from harm and open the eyes of those who would believe lies over truth. Help us forgive those who have wronged us and show us how to move forward in faith. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks upward like earthbound stars. Though homeless and threatened, they were together and unbroken. Martha's pale hands remained steady as she stroked Clara's hair, her faith a quiet flame that even Hale's cruelty could not extinguish. Lucas watched her across the fire, marveling at her strength. The woman who had entered his life as a means to thwart Hale's mockery had become something far more, a source of courage and grace he had never expected to find. The night deepened around their small camp. While in town, Henry Greyhawk sat chained in a cell, and Hale celebrated his victory. But morning would bring new challenges, and they would face them together, armed with nothing but truth and the power of Martha's unwavering faith. Tommy finally succumbed to sleep, curled in his blanket near the fire. Martha continued her quiet vigil, watching over her makeshift family, while Lucas kept guard against the darkness. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, bearing witness to both human cruelty and the enduring strength of hope. Dawn crept over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Wisps of smoke still rose from the blackened ruins of their cabin, a stark reminder of Hale's cruelty. Martha stirred from her uneasy sleep, her bones aching from the hard ground. Beside her, Tommy and Clara huddled close, their faces smudged with yesterday's ash. Lucas had already risen, his tall figure outlined against the morning light. He stood watching the valley below, rifle cradled in his arms. The night's dew had soaked through their blankets, leaving them damp and chilled. "We can't stay here," Lucas said quietly as Martha approached. "Hale's men might return. I know a place. Built a lean-to years ago, deeper in the hills. It ain't much, but it'll keep us out of sight." Martha nodded, touching his arm gently. "Then that's where we'll go. The Lord will provide." They gathered their meager belongings, the saved kettle, Martha's father's Bible, the few tools Lucas had salvaged. Clara coughed harshly as they prepared to leave, the smoke having settled in her lungs during their escape. "How far?" Martha asked, concern creasing her brow as she listened to Clara's ragged breathing. "Half-day's walk," Lucas replied. "There's a stream nearby and plenty of wild herbs growing. You might find something to ease her cough." They set out as the sun climbed higher, Lucas leading the way through stands of pine and over rocky slopes. The children trudged behind Martha, Tommy helping his sister when the path grew steep. Clara's coughing grew worse with exertion, each fit shaking her small frame. By midday, they reached Lucas's hidden refuge. The lean-to nestled against a granite outcropping, its rough-hewn poles and bark roof offering basic shelter from the elements. A small clearing spread before it, bordered by thick brush that provided natural concealment. "It ain't pretty," Lucas said gruffly, "but it'll keep off the wind." Martha surveyed their new home with practical eyes. "We'll make do. Tommy, help me gather some fresh pine boughs for bedding. Clara, you rest here in the shade." While the others worked, Martha explored the surrounding vegetation. Her father had taught her about healing plants, knowledge passed down from her mother. She found what she sought: wild mullein growing in sunny patches, its soft leaves perfect for treating coughs. She gathered the herbs carefully, murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. Returning to the lean-to, she set about preparing a poultice for Clara. The little girl sat quietly as Martha laid the warm herbs against her chest, wrapping them in place with strips torn from her petticoat. "That should help ease the tightness," Martha said softly, stroking Clara's hair. "Rest now, dear one." Lucas had disappeared into the forest with his rifle, seeking game to feed them. The morning's activity had depleted their small store of cornmeal, leaving them with little but hope and prayer. As afternoon waned, Lucas returned carrying 2 plump rabbits. His expression softened at the sight of Martha tending to Clara, whose breathing had grown easier under her care. Without a word, he set about cleaning the game, his skilled hands working quickly. Martha rebuilt their small fire, positioning it where the smoke would disperse through the trees without drawing attention. She used their precious kettle to prepare a simple stew, adding wild onions and the last handful of cornmeal to thicken the broth. The aroma of cooking food drew Tommy from his exploration of their new surroundings. "Smells good," he said, hopefully, reminding them all that he was still just a boy, despite his brave face. As the sun began to set, they gathered close to the fire. Martha bowed her head, her voice hoarse but unwavering as she led them in prayer. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food, for shelter, and for keeping us together. Watch over Henry Greyhawk in his cell, and guide us through these trials. Give us strength to forgive those who persecute us, and wisdom to find your path. Amen." The simple meal tasted like a feast to their hungry bodies. Clara managed several spoonfuls before drifting to sleep, her breathing finally calm and regular. Tommy helped Martha clean the kettle in the nearby stream, moonlight silvering the water as it flowed past. Lucas sat apart, watching them. Shame weighed heavy on his heart. When he'd shown Martha that marriage deed, he'd meant only to spare her from Hale's mockery. Now, his actions had brought danger to them all. He'd sworn after the war never to risk another soul in his battles. Yet here was this gentle woman and 2 innocent children, homeless because of him. But as he watched Martha return to the fire, her pale skin glowing in the firelight, he knew he could never send them away. Somehow, without his noticing, they had become family. The thought of returning to his solitary existence felt impossible now. Martha settled the children on their bed of pine boughs, tucking the salvaged blankets around them. Her clear voice rose softly in an evening hymn. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The familiar words floated through the darkening forest. Tommy's eyes drifted closed, his hand still clasped in Clara's. Martha continued singing, her faith turning their humble shelter into something sacred. Lucas lay back on his own rough bed, staring up at stars visible through gaps in the lean-to's roof. The woman's voice washed over him, stirring memories of his mother singing these same hymns long ago. He'd thought that part of himself dead, destroyed by war and loss. But Martha's unwavering faith had awakened something he'd forgotten. Hope. As night settled fully around them, Lucas made a silent vow. Hale might have burned their cabin and imprisoned their friend, but he would not destroy this fragile family. Whatever came next, Lucas would protect them with everything he had. Martha's song faded into the night's quiet. Only the soft breathing of the children and the occasional pop of dying embers broke the silence. Their situation was desperate. No proper shelter, few supplies, and a powerful enemy hunting them. Yet Martha's faith remained unshaken, her presence an anchor in the storm of their circumstances. Lucas watched as she finally settled down to sleep, her pale hair catching the last gleams of firelight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe. In this hidden hollow among the hills, they had found temporary refuge. It would have to be enough until they could find a way to save Henry and reclaim their home. The night deepened. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. Lucas kept his vigil, rifle close at hand, guarding his unexpected family's sleep. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witnesses to both their trials and their determination to face whatever morning might bring. Dawn broke over Willow Bend, painting the dusty streets in pale gold. Already, clusters of townsfolk gathered around the newly posted notices nailed to the general store's weathered boards. The railroad's claim to the spring was printed in bold letters, complete with official-looking seals and flourishing signatures. Martha sat straight in her saddle as she and Lucas rode into town, her pale hands steady on the reins. She had traded her usual dark dress for a plain riding skirt, but her dignity remained undiminished. Lucas rode beside her, his expression grim as passers-by stopped to stare and whisper. "Look there," a woman muttered, clutching her shawl. "The albino preacher's girl, bold as brass." "And that mountain man," another added. "Heard tell they're living wild since hail burned them out." Lucas's jaw tightened, but Martha touched his arm. "Let them talk," she said softly. "We know the truth." They dismounted outside the town clerk's office, tethering their horses to the hitching post. Martha carried her father's worn Bible close, its leather cover smooth from years of use. Lucas held the door for her, the bell above tinkling as they entered. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and ink. Morning light filtered through grimy windows, illuminating dancing motes in the air. Behind his desk, Mr. Whitaker, the town clerk, looked up from his ledger. His thin face paled at the sight of them. "Mr. Whitaker," Martha said clearly, "we've come about the spring." The clerk adjusted his spectacles nervously. "The railroad's deed was filed yesterday. All quite proper, I assure you." "Proper?" Lucas's voice held thunder. "That deed's as false as a rattler's smile." Martha laid a gentle hand on Lucas's arm before addressing the clerk. "Sir, would you examine those signatures again? We believe they merit closer inspection." Whitaker hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting Sheriff Hale to burst through at any moment. Finally, he pulled out the railroad's deed with trembling fingers. The paper was crisp and new, unlike Martha's weathered document. "These signatures?" Martha pointed out. "They're supposed to be from my father and the previous landowner. But look closely, sir. The ink is fresh, though both men have been dead these 3 years." The clerk adjusted his spectacles again, bending. Close to study the writing, sweat beaded on his forehead. "Well, that is to say, you know it's forged," Lucas said flatly. "Hale's work, or the railroad's." Martha opened her father's Bible, carefully removing a folded paper from between its pages. The document was yellowed but well preserved, protected by the Holy Book's pages. "This is the church record," she explained. "It shows the original agreement, witnessed by the congregation and signed by my father himself." Whitaker took the paper with unsteady hands. His eyes widened as he read. "This is very thorough. The signatures match those in our older records." He glanced up at them. "But Sheriff Hale has no right to steal what belongs to others," Martha finished firmly. "You know that, sir." The clerk's shoulders slumped. He was a timid man, but not a dishonest one. I'll review these documents carefully, compare them to our records." He swallowed hard. "But I can't promise." "Just do what's right," Lucas said. "That's all we ask." Outside, more townsfolk had gathered, drawn by news of their arrival. Martha held her head high as she and Lucas emerged, but she heard the whispers clearly enough. "Railroad men been throwing their weight around something fierce," one rancher muttered. "Hale's in their pocket clear as day," another agreed. "Ain't right. What he's doing." "That poor Indian fella in jail," a woman added. "Everyone knows he never stole no horses." Lucas's hand moved toward his gun belt, his thoughts turning to Greyhawk languishing in Hale's jail. Martha saw the movement and gripped his arm tightly. "No," she whispered. "Not like that. He's suffering in there," Lucas growled. "I could get him out tonight. Already got a plan." Martha's pale eyes met his, steady and sure. "Justice must be seen as lawful, not stolen," she insisted. If we break him out, we become the criminals Hale claims we are. We must trust in the Lord's timing." Lucas stared at her, something shifting in his weathered face. Her faith ran deeper than he'd imagined, stronger than his own battered belief in justice. While he thought in terms of immediate action, she saw the longer path, one that might actually change hearts and minds. They rode back to their hidden camp in thoughtful silence. The lean-to looked even more humble after their visit to town, its rough poles and bark roof a far cry from proper shelter. But Tommy and Clara ran out to meet them, their faces brightening at their return. That evening, as Martha stirred their simple supper over the fire, Tommy sat close beside her. The boy had grown quieter since losing their home, his young face more serious than any child's should be. "Miss Martha?" he asked softly. "Will we always be running? Always hiding out here in the woods?" Martha set aside her cooking spoon and drew the boy close. His small body trembled slightly against her side. "No, dear one," she assured him. "God's justice prevails in time. We must be patient and keep faith." "But how do you know?" Tommy persisted. "How can you be sure?" Martha smiled gently, touching the Bible that rested nearby. "Because I've seen it before. My father taught me that truth cannot stay buried forever. Light always finds its way through the darkness." Lucas, listening from where he cleaned his rifle, felt something stir in his chest. He'd lost his faith in justice long ago, buried it with too many fallen comrades, but watching Martha comfort the boy, her quiet certainty glowing like a beacon, he wondered if perhaps he'd been wrong. The evening deepened around their small camp. Clara slept peacefully on her bed of pine boughs, her breathing finally clear of smoke. Tommy remained pressed against Martha's side, finding comfort in her steady presence. Above them, stars began to appear through the trees, unchanged by all the troubles below. Martha's voice rose softly in an evening hymn carrying their hopes heavenward. Lucas watched her in the firelight, marveling at how this gentle woman's faith might prove stronger than any weapon in their arsenal. Perhaps she was right. Justice would come, in God's own time. The night settled around them, dark but not hopeless. In town, wheels of justice had begun to turn, however slowly. The truth Martha carried in her father's Bible might yet overcome Hale's forged papers, and if enough people found the courage to stand against corruption, even the mighty railroad might be forced to bow to justice. Tommy finally drifted to sleep, his head resting in Martha's lap. She stroked his hair tenderly, her pale fingers glowing in the dying firelight. Lucas added wood to the flames, their small circle of warmth a testament to survival against all odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had this moment of peace. Martha's faith illuminated their refuge like a lantern in the wilderness, showing them all a path through the darkness ahead. Dark clouds gathered over the valley like a heavy wool blanket, turning the afternoon dim as twilight. The wind picked up, rustling through the pines and setting the lean-to's bark roof rattling. Martha looked up from where she stirred their meager stew, concern creasing her brow. "Storm's coming," Lucas said, scanning the darkening sky. He'd learned to read weather during his scouting days, and these clouds spoke of a serious blow. "Better secure what we can." Tommy helped gather their few possessions, tucking them deeper under the lean-to shelter. Clara huddled near the fire, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, sizzling in the cooking fire. The storm hit with sudden fury. Wind-driven rain lashed sideways, finding every gap in their crude shelter. Martha hurried to move the children to the driest corner, spreading what blankets they had to keep them warm. Lucas worked quickly, breaking fresh pine boughs and layering them overhead to strengthen their roof. "Here," he called over the wind's howl, passing Martha more branches. "Weave these tight together. It'll help shed the water." Thunder boomed overhead, making Clara whimper. Martha drew the girl close, humming a hymn to comfort her. The lean-to creaked and swayed, but Lucas had built it strong. Still, water found its way through, dripping steadily in places. "The fire," Martha said with worry, watching their precious flames sputter under the onslaught. She moved to shield it with her body, feeding it dry kindling from their protected store. Lucas admired her determination. That fire meant warmth, hot food, and survival. The storm settled in for a siege, rain drumming steadily overhead. They huddled together in the growing darkness, sharing body heat. Tommy dozed fitfully against Martha's side while Clara shivered despite the blankets wrapped around her. During a brief lull in the thunder, Lucas spoke quietly. "Reminds me of nights during the war," he said, surprising himself. He rarely spoke of those times. "Huddled with my unit, trying to keep dry in weather like this." Martha turned toward his voice in the dimness. "You've never talked about the war before?" "No." Lucas stared into the flames. "Lost too many good men. Brothers, really, after what we went through together." His voice grew rough with memory. "Williams took a bullet at Gettysburg. Roberts died of fever in camp. Parker Ambe." He swallowed hard. "Parker died in my arms during a thunderstorm just like this." Martha's pale hand found his in the darkness. "That's why you came to these mountains? To escape the memories?" "Figured I'd be better off alone. Couldn't bear to care about folks again. To watch them die." His fingers tightened around hers. "Wasn't right that I survived when better men didn't." "Oh, Lucas." Tears glimmered in Martha's eyes, catching the firelight. "God spared you for more than regret. Those men, your brothers, they'd want you to live fully, to help others as you've helped us." Before Lucas could respond, a violent cough shook Clara's small frame. Martha turned to the girl in alarm, touching her forehead. "She's burning up," Martha said, fear threading her voice. "The damp and cold." Clara's teeth chattered despite the fever heating her skin. Her breathing came in ragged gasps between coughing fits. Martha worked quickly, heating water in their battered kettle and soaking cloth strips to lay across the child's forehead. "We need willow bark tea," she said. "But in this storm—" "I'll go," Lucas offered, reaching for his coat. Martha caught his arm. "No, it's too dangerous in the dark. We'll make do with what we have." Through the long night, Martha tended Clara with desperate dedication. She bathed the girl's face with cool cloths, wrapped her in every blanket they could spare, and whispered prayers without ceasing. Lucas paced the small shelter like a caged mountain lion, feeling helpless as Clara's fever climbed higher. Thunder crashed overhead, and Clara cried out weakly. "Mama!" she called, delirious. "Mama, where are you?" Martha gathered the girl into her arms, rocking her gently. "Shh, dear one, you're safe. We're here." Lucas watched them, his heart clenching. He'd sworn never to let himself care this much again, never to risk the pain of loss. But somehow these three had worked their way past his defenses, the brave, faithful woman, and the two children who needed them so desperately. Another violent coughing spell seized Clara, leaving her gasping for breath. Lucas couldn't bear it anymore. He dropped to his knees beside them, something breaking open inside him. "Lord," he whispered, hoarsely, the words strange on his tongue after so long. "I know I haven't talked to you since the war. Didn't reckon you'd want to hear from me after everything. But please," his voice cracked, "please don't take this child. Give us strength to help her. I'm asking, I'm begging." Martha's hand found his shoulder, steadying him as he prayed. Together they kept vigil through the storm's fury, watching over Clara's fragile struggle. Tommy huddled close, his young face scared but determined to help however he could. The hours crawled by like wounded things. Lucas fed the fire, Martha changed the cool cloths, and the storm raged on. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, Clara's breathing began to ease. Her fever-bright eyes grew calmer, focusing on their faces instead of phantoms. Near dawn, the storm began to break. Rain softened to a gentle patter, and the wind died down to whispers in the pines. The first pale light of morning found Clara sleeping peacefully, her fever broken at last. Martha sagged with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes from the sleepless night. But she smiled as she touched Clara's cool forehead. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. Lucas stood in the shelter's entrance, watching the storm clouds retreat. The valley below lay washed clean, glittering with rain. Something had been washed clean inside him too, some hard crust of doubt and bitterness worn away by the night's desperate prayers. "You were right," he said quietly to Martha, "about God having purpose for those he spares." She came to stand beside him, her pale features touched with dawn's gold. "We're all here for a reason, Lucas. Perhaps this is yours. Not just to survive, but to help others survive too." Clara stirred then, waking fully for the first time since her fever broke. "Miss Martha," she called weakly. "Mr. Lucas?" They hurried back to her side. The girl's face was tired but clear, her eyes bright with recognition instead of fever. Tommy squeezed his sister's hand, grinning with relief. "We're here. See heart," Martha assured her, smoothing Clara's tangled hair. "How do you feel?" "Better," Clara whispered. "I heard you praying for me. Both of you." Lucas knelt beside her pallet, his weathered face gentle. "That's right, little one. And God heard us too." Martha's eyes filled with tears of joy at his words. The man who'd forgotten how to pray had found his faith again, drawn back to belief by love for a sick child. Outside, the morning sun broke through the last clouds, setting the rain-washed world aglow. Their lean-to was battered but still standing. They were wet, tired, and humbled by the night's vigil. But they were together, their small family bound closer by shared prayers and answered mercy. Clara drifted back to sleep, her breathing easy and regular. Tommy curled up beside her, his brotherly vigilance finally giving way to exhaustion. Martha leaned against Lucas's shoulder, her strength spent, but her spirit peaceful. The storm had passed, leaving them all changed in its wake. Through the long, dark hours, they'd discovered something stronger than wind or rain, the power of faith renewed, of love that refused to surrender, of prayers that bridged the distance between earth and heaven. Lucas looked down at Martha's pale head resting against him, at the sleeping children they'd nearly lost. He'd thought himself finished with prayer, done with believing. But here, in this humble shelter, watching over this unlikely family, he'd found his way back to faith through love. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the storm's fury washed away by gentle sunshine. Lucas stood outside their makeshift shelter, studying the brightening sky. The lean-to had served them through desperate hours, but they couldn't hide in the hills forever. Not with Clara still weak from fever. Not with justice waiting to be claimed. "We're riding into town today," he announced as Martha stirred their morning coffee over the fire. She looked up, her pale features composed. "Are you certain that's wise?" Clara's still recovering. As if to emphasize the point, a soft cough came from inside the shelter where Clara rested, wrapped in their last dry blanket. Tommy sat beside his sister, protective as always. "Can't stay out here much longer," Lucas said, his voice gentle but firm. "Winter's, Besides, it's time we faced Hale and his lies head-on." Martha nodded slowly. "You're right, of course." She touched Clara's forehead. "The fever's gone, thank the Lord. She should manage the ride if we take it slow." They broke camp efficiently, having little enough to pack. Lucas helped Martha settle Clara in the wagon bed, cushioned with pine boughs. Tommy perched beside his sister, holding her hand. The morning air was cool and sweet after the storm, scented with wet earth and pine. The wagon creaked as they wound down from the hills, every rut and stone making Clara wince despite the careful padding. Martha sat in back with the children while Lucas handled the reins, his shoulders tense with purpose. They passed the blackened ruins of their cabin, a stark reminder of all they'd lost, and all they still had to fight for. The town came into view by mid-morning, muddy streets beginning to dry under the autumn sun. A few townsfolk paused to stare as Lucas guided the wagon past the general store. Martha held her head high, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. They stopped first at the church, a humble wooden structure with a crooked cross above the door. Lucas helped Martha down from the wagon, then lifted Clara gently. The girl's face was pale but determined as they carried her inside. The church interior was cool and dim, smelling of dust and old hymnals. Reverend Pike looked up from his desk, his thin face startled. "Miss Carter? Mr. Boone?" He stood awkwardly, wringing his hands. I've been hoping you'd come." "Have you now?" Lucas's tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. The Reverend seemed to shrink further, but something sparked in his watery eyes. Yes, I have." He moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk, hands shaking slightly as he worked the key. I've been a coward, Miss Carter. Watching how they treated you, seeing Hale's corruption grow unchecked." He withdrew a leather folder, worn with age. "Your father, he was a good man, a brave man. Everything I've failed to be." Martha stepped forward, her pale features softening with compassion. "You're being too hard on yourself, Reverend?" "No." Pike shook his head firmly. "I'm not. I've kept silent too long, fearing Hale's influence. But your father—" He opened the folder carefully. "Your father was wise enough to ensure certain documents were preserved, in duplicate. He spread several papers on his desk, land deeds, water rights, church records, all bearing dates and signatures from years past. I kept these hidden, knowing someday they might be needed. The originals your father left with you weren't the only copies." Martha's hands trembled as she touched the documents. "These prove our claim to the spring, the marriage arrangement, everything." "Yes." Pike's voice strengthened. "Every signature witnessed, every transaction properly recorded. Hale's forged documents won't stand against these." Lucas studied the papers intently. "This is what we needed. Legal proof that can't be ignored." He looked at the Reverend with new respect. "Thank you for keeping these safe. Don't thank me." Pike's face flushed with shame. "I should have spoken up weeks ago when Hale first started his persecution. Should have stood against him openly instead of hiding these away like a frightened mouse." Martha touched his arm gently. "You're standing up now. That's what matters." "You're too kind, Miss Carter." Pike squared his shoulders slightly. "But I mean to make it right. I'll testify to the authenticity of these documents. It's time someone spoke truth to Hale's power." Tommy, who had been listening intently, piped up from where he sat with Clara. "Does this mean we can go home?" "Soon, child." Martha smiled at him. "Very soon." They gathered the precious documents carefully, Pike helping them organize everything into a clear case against Hale's claims. Clara dozed in a pew while they worked, her breathing easier in the church's quiet shelter. By late afternoon, they had what they needed. Lucas loaded their small family back into the wagon, the documents secured safely in Martha's Bible. But instead of heading back to their hillside shelter, he turned the horses toward the spring. "Lucas?" Martha questioned softly. "Where are we going?" "Home," he said simply. "Or what will be home again?" He guided the wagon to a flat stretch of ground near the spring, where the soil was firm and the view stretched across the valley. The water burbled clearly from between moss-covered rocks, caddying the late sunlight like scattered gems. "We'll build here," Lucas announced, helping them down from the wagon. "Nothing fancy at first, just a rough shelter to keep us dry. But it'll be a start." Martha's eyes filled with tears as she realized his meaning. They weren't hiding anymore. They were claiming their ground, planting their flag where everyone could see it. Lucas had brought tools and lumber in the wagon bed, prepared for this moment. While Martha built a cooking fire and set a pot of stew to simmer, he began constructing a simple shelter. The rhythmic sound of his hammer filled the valley as the sun westered toward evening. Tommy helped gather stones for the fire ring while Clara sat wrapped in a blanket, her color slowly returning in the fresh air. The children's laughter, though still subdued, rang out occasionally as they watched a family of quail scurry past their camp. Martha's voice rose sweet and clear as she stirred the stew pot, singing an old hymn her father had loved. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The familiar words floated on the evening air, twining with the smoke from their fire, reaching toward the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Lucas paused in his work, watching Martha in the firelight. Her pale skin glowed golden, her face serene despite all they'd endured. The children leaned against her, drawn to her gentle strength like moths to a flame. When the stars were fully out and the children settled for sleep in their newly built shelter, Lucas and Martha sat by the dying fire. The spring murmured its endless song beside them, a promise of life and renewal. "Your father," Lucas said quietly. "He was right about a lot of things, wasn't he?" Martha looked at him questioningly. "About faith. About standing firm in what's right no matter the cost." He gestured to the sleeping children, the rough shelter, the precious spring. "About building something that matters." "He would have liked you," Martha said softly. "He would have seen past your gruff exterior to the good man beneath." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead. "I stopped believing in much of anything after the war," he admitted. "Figured God had turned his back on us all, but these past weeks..." He reached for Martha's hand in the darkness. "Maybe your father's faith wasn't in vain after all." Martha's fingers tightened around his. Above them, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the sky. The same stars that had witnessed their trials now watched over their growing hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a confrontation with hail that couldn't be avoided. But tonight, they had shelter, food, and each other. Tonight, they had proof of their rightful claim and the courage to defend it. Together, they sat in peaceful silence, listening to the spring's endless song and the soft breathing of their sleeping children. Whatever came next, they would face it together, their faith renewed, their purpose clear as the stars overhead. Word of the public hearing spread through Willow Bend like wildfire. By mid-morning, wagons and riders converged on the white-painted church, kicking up dust clouds that hung golden in the autumn light. Ranchers in their Sunday best stood awkwardly beside railroad men in tailored suits. Townswomen whispered behind their fans while children darted between the adults' legs. Lucas guided their wagon carefully through the crowd, one protective hand on Martha's back as she cradled Clara in her arms. Tommy clung close to her skirts, his young face solemn. The morning sun caught Martha's pale hair like a halo, making some townspeople step back and cross themselves superstitiously. Inside the church, every pew was packed. The air grew thick with the smell of wool suits and nervous sweat. Reverend Pike had arranged a table at the front where Mayor Thompson sat with 2 county judges who'd ridden in for the hearing. Papers and legal books lay spread before them. Sheriff Hale arrived last, the silver star on his chest catching the light as he swaggered down the center aisle. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. "Well now," Hale drawled, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "Ain't a fine gathering to settle a simple matter of property?" He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket with a flourish. "I have here a properly registered deed showing the railroad's clear title to that spring and all surrounding lands." He slapped the paper down on the judge's table. "Signed, witnessed, and recorded according to law, unlike some other claims we might hear today." His eyes fixed on Martha with open contempt. Lucas felt Martha stiffen beside him, but her voice remained steady as she rose. "If it pleases the court, I have evidence to present as well." She stepped forward, her simple calico dress a stark contrast to Hale's flashy vest and watch chain. From her basket, she withdrew her father's Bible, handling it with reverence. "My father was Reverend William Carter," she began. "He served this community for 15 years before his passing. In this Bible, he kept records of his ministry and business dealings." Her pale fingers trembled slightly as she opened to a marked page. "Including the original deed to the spring property, witnessed by 3 elders of this church." A railroad lawyer in a sleek black suit stepped forward. "Your Honor, surely you won't accept personal papers as legal evidence. This woman is—" He paused significantly. "Hardly a reliable witness." "And why is that, Counselor?" Lucas' deep voice cut through the tension. He stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "Because of how she looks? Or because she shows more Christian charity in one day than you've managed in your entire life?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several ranchers nodded in agreement. "Order," Mayor Thompson called, tapping his gavel. "We'll hear all evidence properly presented." Martha withdrew more papers from the Bible. "I have here the original water rights agreement, showing how my father intended the spring to serve the entire community, not just private interests." "And I have something to add," Reverend Pike spoke up, his reedy voice stronger than usual. He approached the table with his leather folder. "As church secretary, I kept duplicate records of all official transactions. These documents verify Miss Carter's claim completely." Hale's face darkened. "That spring is worth a fortune to the railroad. You expect us to believe some wandering preacher had legal right to it? And left it to—" His lip curled. "Her?" The word dripped with such venom that several women gasped. Clara buried her face in Martha's skirt while Tommy glared defiantly at the sheriff. "I've got something to say about that." A weathered rancher stood up. "Name's Jim Hawkins. I was there when Reverend Carter first found that spring. Helped him clear the land around it. Man always said it was, and God's gift to the valley meant to be shared, never turned away a thirsty animal or person, no matter who owned them." Other old-timers nodded, calling out agreement. "That's gospel truth." The railroad lawyer tried to regain control. "The territory is expanding. Progress demands certain sacrifices. This spring could service dozens of locomotives, bringing prosperity." "Prosperity for who?" Lucas interrupted. "For men like you who've never worked this land? Never watched children go thirsty in drought years?" His voice grew passionate. "You look at Martha and see something to mock. But I see a woman who took in orphans without hesitation, who feeds any hungry neighbor, who prays for those who spite her." He turned to face the crowded church. "Some call her cursed because she looks different. I call her blessed because she shows us what grace truly means." His eyes met Martha's for a moment. "That spring was meant to give life, not line pockets, and there's no one better to steward it than her." A long silence followed his words. Martha's pale cheeks flushed pink, but she stood straight and proud. The judges conferred in whispers while tension crackled through the church. Hale's hand strayed toward his gun until he noticed how many hard eyes watched him. The railroad lawyer shuffled his papers nervously. "Let's examine these documents more closely," the senior judge announced. He began comparing the railroad's deed with the church records. His frown deepened as he studied the signatures. "Sheriff Hale," he said finally, "these witnesses on your deed. Where might we find them?" Hale shifted uncomfortably. "Drifters, most likely. Moving through. Interesting." The judge held the paper to the light. "Since 2 of these names belong to men I know for certain died 3 years ago." A gasp went up from the crowd. The railroad lawyer began edging toward the door. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this paper stock wasn't available when this deed was supposedly signed. It's a recent manufacture." He fixed Hale with a stern gaze. "Would you care to explain these discrepancies?" Hale's face went purple. "Now see here." "I think we've seen enough," Mayor Thompson interrupted. He stood, addressing the packed church. "The original deed and water rights held by Miss Carter are clearly authentic. witnessed by reputable citizens still living among us. The railroad's claim is hereby rejected." A cheer went up from the ranchers. Martha sagged slightly in relief, and Lucas steadied her with a gentle hand. "As for you, Sheriff," the judge added grimly, "we'll be having a long discussion about attempted fraud and abuse of authority." Hale looked wildly around the church but found no sympathetic faces. Even his deputies stepped back, unwilling to meet his eyes. His hand twitched toward his gun one last time, but Lucas's quiet step forward made him think better of it. The afternoon sun slanted through the church windows as the crowd began to disperse. Women stopped to squeeze Martha's hand or pat the children's heads. Ranchers clapped Lucas on the back. Even Reverend Pike stood straighter, accepting quiet thanks for his role in preserving the truth. Outside, the autumn air had grown crisp. Martha gathered Clara and Tommy close while Lucas brought the wagon around. Their small family had faced the worst of human nature and emerged stronger. The spring would continue to serve all who needed it, just as her father had intended. As they drove home, the setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and purple. The spring's waters caught the light like scattered diamonds, singing their endless song of life and hope. Martha's quiet voice rose in a hymn of thanksgiving, and one by one, the children joined in. Lucas guided the horses with sure hands, his heart full of gratitude for the strange and wonderful path that had led him to this moment. The solitude he'd once craved had been replaced by something far richer, a family bound by love rather than blood, and a purpose worthy of his protection. Dawn painted the sky in pale streaks as Sheriff Hale gathered his deputies behind the livery stable. Their boots kicked up dust as they marched toward the white-painted church where Martha and Lucas had taken shelter overnight. "Break it down," Hale commanded, gesturing at the heavy wooden doors. But townsfolk had been watching. Men and women rushed forward, linking arms to form a human barrier. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, planted herself firmly in front. "You'll not harm that girl today." Hale's face twisted with rage. "Move aside. I've got authority here." "Not anymore," came a familiar voice. Henry Greyhawk stepped into view, his presence drawing gasps from the crowd. In his hand, he held a leather portfolio. "Good people freed me last night. Found these in your office while they were at it." He opened the portfolio, revealing letters and telegrams. "Proof of your dealings with the railroad men. Bribes. Forged documents. Even plans to dam up the spring." The railroad lawyer, reading over Greyhawk's shoulder, blanched. I must send word to my superiors. This arrangement is terminated." He hurried away, leaving Hale standing alone. With a roar of fury, Hale drew his pistol. But Lucas moved like lightning, his war-trained reflexes taking control. One smooth motion knocked the gun aside. Another trapped Hale's wrist. The sheriff found himself face down in the dirt, Lucas binding his hands with rope. "You could have shot me," Hale spat. "That's not justice," Lucas replied quietly. "That's just more violence." Heavy footsteps approached. The county marshal, summoned by telegram the previous day, stood over Hale, with iron manacles ready. "Carter Hale," the marshal intoned, "you're under arrest for corruption, arson, and false imprisonment." The crowd erupted in cheers as Hale was led away, his badge torn from his shirt. Justice had finally come to Willow Bend, brought not by guns but by truth and courage. The afternoon sun glinted off the spring's surface as townsfolk gathered at its rocky edges. The water bubbled clear and sweet from the earth, a promise of life in the dusty valley. Martha stood before them, her pale hands clasped in prayer, her white hair catching the golden light. "Lord," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we dedicate these waters as a blessing for all your children. May they nourish the town, sustain the ranches, and honor the ancient rights of the tribal lands." Henry Greyhawk stood tall beside her, dignity in his bearing. "Such wisdom brings more strength than iron rails," he said, touching his heart in respect. "When we share the Creator's gifts, we become true kin." Tommy and Clara splashed at the spring's edge, their laughter mixing with other children who had joined them. The sound echoed off the granite rocks, sweeter than any sermon. Nearby, Lucas worked steadily, setting fresh-cut timbers for their new home's foundation. The sharp scent of pine sap filled the air as he measured and marked each beam with care. Martha knelt at the water's edge, dipping a wooden bucket. The surface rippled, reflecting her face. She remembered the cruel jeers of fat albino girl that had followed her through town just weeks ago. Now she saw something different in those waters. A woman chosen to guard this precious gift for all. Lucas set down his tools and crossed to her, his calloused hand covering hers on the bucket's handle. "We'll build it right this time," he said softly. "Not just walls and a roof, but a true home. A family." Tommy and Clara ran to them, dripping and laughing. "Our family?" Tommy asked hopefully. Martha gathered them close as the evening light turned honey gold across the valley. "Yes," she whispered. "Our family." The spring burbled peacefully, its waters a promise kept, a blessing shared, a future secured through faith and love rather than force. Lantern light danced across the newly built cabin's weathered logs as autumn's first chill touched the evening air. Weeks of hard work had transformed the ashes of loss into a home twice the size of the old one, with room enough for all who gathered. The scent of Martha's venison stew filled the yard, where townsfolk and their Ute neighbors shared blankets and conversation. Fiddle music floated on the breeze as Tommy taught other children to dance, their boots raising happy dust in the twilight. Clara, her health restored, followed Martha with a basket of fresh cornbread, offering it to each guest with shy pride. Henry Greyhawk sat near the fire, his deep voice carrying across the yard as he shared stories of the valley's ancient days. Children gathered close, their eyes wide as he spoke of how the spring had sustained his people through countless seasons. Even the most skeptical townsfolk leaned in, caught by the power of his words. Reverend Pike rose slowly, his earlier timidity replaced by quiet conviction. "Let us pray," he began, thanking the Lord for teaching us that true strength flows not from power over others, but from sharing his bounty. Heads bowed as his voice grew stronger. "May this water and this fellowship bind us as one community, under your grace." Martha moved among the guests, her white hair catching the golden light. No one flinched from her pale skin now. They reached for her hands, thanking her for the meal, for her welcome, for her faith in them all. She paused beside Lucas, who watched her with wonder. As the meal drew to a close, Martha gathered the makeshift choir. Their voices rose in harmony, singing the old hymns that had once echoed in her father's church. But now her voice lifted clear and strong, no longer shaking with fear of mockery. Joy filled each note as she led them in amazing grace. Lucas stood, overwhelmed by the sight of her transformed from the wounded soul he defended that day in town. Before all their neighbors, he took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. Her smile, radiant in the firelight, spoke of a love born in courage and sealed in faith. The music swelled as darkness settled over the valley, carrying their song of thanksgiving into the star-filled night. Sunlight streamed through the church's weathered windows, casting golden beams across the worn floorboards. Martha stood before the congregation in her flowing white choir robe, her pale features radiant with inner peace. Tommy and Clara flanked her sides, their small hands clasped in hers, while Lucas sat proudly in the front pew, his usual mountain man roughness softened by his Sunday best. As the first notes of Rock of Ages filled the sanctuary, Martha's voice rose clear and strong, no longer carrying the tremor of shame that once haunted her singing. The children's sweet voices joined hers, and soon the whole church swelled with harmony. Townsfolk who had once whispered cruel jokes now sat transfixed, some wiping away tears as her melody touched their hearts. Reverend Pike stepped to his pulpit, standing straighter than before. "The Lord often reveals his greatest strength through those the world calls weak," he preached, his gentle eyes meeting Martha's. "Through faith and perseverance, what others mock as cursed becomes blessed indeed." After the final hymn faded, the congregation spilled out into the bright morning air. One by one, neighbors who had once turned away now approached with warm handshakes and genuine smiles. Martha received each greeting with grace, her quiet dignity touching hearts more deeply than words could express. Henry Greyhawk sat astride his horse at the edge of the churchyard, his dark eyes approving as he watched the scene unfold. He touched his hat brim respectfully toward Martha and Lucas, before turning his mount toward the reservation trails. Lucas scooped Tommy up onto his broad shoulders, the boy's delighted laugh ringing across the yard. Clara clung to Martha's skirts, her small face beaming as she skipped alongside. Together they started the walk home, the morning sun warming their backs as they followed the familiar path toward their cabin. As they walked, Lucas gazed at his family, the wife who had transformed his solitude into belonging, the children who filled his days with purpose. He marveled at how God's hand had worked through Martha's unwavering faith, turning the town's cruel ridicule into respect, their curse into blessing, and his lonely existence into the richness of family love. The valley stretched before them, peaceful and promising as they made their way home together, each step a testimony to love's power to redeem. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.